The crowd was electric, a sea of young, hopeful faces gathered on a beautiful campus courtyard, bathed in the afternoon sun. They came to hear a man known for his fiery debates and unflinching convictions. A man who built an empire on a single, simple idea: prove me wrong. On September 10th, 2025, Charlie Kirk took the stage at Utah Valley University. Confident, charismatic, and completely unaware that this would be his final performance. It was a perfectly ordinary day, until a single, sharp sound cut through the air. A gunshot. The moment hangs in time like a shattered pane of glass. One moment, a man is speaking, the next, he is falling. The scene erupts. Screams tear through the peaceful courtyard. People scatter, running for cover, their excitement replaced by sheer terror. It was not a random act of violence. It was a single shot, fired with cold precision from a rooftop, a brutal end to a life defined by public debate. If you find this story unsettling, if the idea of political violence leaves you with a knot in your stomach, then you have to stick around. This isn't just a story about a man's death. It's about what it reveals about the world we live in. It's about how a single bullet can change everything, and how the search for justice can lead to places you never expected. Your like, comment, share, and subscription not only helps this channel, but it helps ensure that stories like this are never forgotten. So please, take a moment to interact with the video. Your support matters. The authorities were baffled. A public figure assassinated in broad daylight with thousands of witnesses, and the shooter vanished without a trace. The initial chaos led to dead ends and false arrests. The man suspected of pulling the trigger was released, leaving law enforcement with nothing but questions. Who was the sniper? What was the motive? And how could a killing this bold, this calculated, happen in a place that prides itself on being one of the safest in the nation? The story of Charlie Kirk's murder is a chilling tale of an investigation that would expose more than just a killer. It would expose the cracks in a society teetering on the edge. Did you ever stop to think how much influence a single teenager can wield, and how far that influence can stretch before it collides with something unstoppable? Picture this. The year is 2012. A young man, only 18 years old, still in the flush of adolescence, is sitting at his desk in suburban Illinois. He isn't a prodigy from Harvard. He isn't a millionaire's heir. He isn't even in college, at least not for long. And yet, within a decade, his voice will echo in the halls of Congress, reverberate through packed arenas, and flood the endless feeds of TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Millions will listen. Millions will argue. Millions will rage. And millions will believe. That young man's name was Charlie Kirk. And what he built would not only polarize campuses, it would redraw the map of youth politics in America. But here's the truth that makes people shift uneasily in their seats. Whether you admired him or despised him, whether you thought he was a courageous defender of free speech or a manipulator of fragile minds, his presence mattered. It mattered so much that when he was silenced, the void was immediate, unavoidable, and terrifying. So the question is not whether you agreed with Charlie Kirk. The question is whether you can afford to ignore what his story reveals about the future we're all stepping into. If you think you can, then stop watching now. But if you know you can't, if something in you whispers that you must understand this, then stay until the very end. And before we go further, subscribe. Do it right now. Because if you don't, this is what will happen. You'll drift on, distracted, forgetting that you once glimpsed the fault lines shaking beneath your feet. You'll leave unprepared for the next shock. And if that's the choice you want to make, at least be honest. Go into the comments and tell us why. Tell the world you chose ignorance. Tell us you decided not to be part of this reckoning. But for those who stay, let's begin. Charlie Kirk was born in 1993 in the suburban calm of Arlington Heights, Illinois, the son of a father who built homes and a mother who worked as a counselor and trader. There was nothing in those early years that screamed destiny. He played sports, attended Wheeling High School, lived a life that could have remained private and ordinary. Yet, something began to stir in him. He consumed stories of Ronald Reagan. He admired the crisp, commanding voice of talk radio. He looked at the landscape of his high school classrooms and felt outnumbered by teachers he thought were pushing liberal ideology. In those classrooms, the seed was planted. A teenage boy looked around and told himself that something was wrong, that his peers were being led astray, that if someone didn't fight back, a whole generation would slip away. Most teenagers grumble, most shrug, most forget. Charlie didn't. He acted. By 2012, when most of his friends were sending off college applications, Charlie took a different leap. With encouragement from a Tea Party activist named Bill Montgomery and financial backing from conservative philanthropist Foster Friess, Charlie founded Turning Point USA. Imagine that moment. No college degree, no political office, just a teenager with conviction and a handful of connections. Yet he gave his organization a bold mission: to identify, educate, train, and organize students to promote principles of fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. But slogans weren't enough. Charlie knew this. He needed theater. He needed spectacle. He needed to show up on campuses where his very presence would provoke debate, confrontation, outrage. And so, Turning Point USA began what some would call a revolution. Others, an indoctrination. And it started with folding tables and posters at colleges across America. The message? Your professors are brainwashing you. Your classrooms are biased. Your generation has been hijacked. Stand up. Fight back. And people listened. As Turning Point USA grew, it became impossible to ignore. Its presence spread across hundreds of campuses, then over 1,000. Charlie Kirk's youthful energy, his rapid-fire delivery, his willingness to lock eyes and throw down with hecklers, all of it drew attention. But attention is never free. And with it came controversy. Turning Point USA launched what became its most infamous project, the Professor Watch List, a database naming and shaming professors accused of pushing leftist ideology. Critics called it harassment, intimidation, even a blacklist. Supporters called it transparency, accountability, resistance. The divide sharpened, the tension thickened, and Charlie Kirk's name grew larger. By the time the 2016 election approached, the young activist who had once stood outside classrooms with a pamphlet in hand was now being ushered into rooms with some of the most powerful conservatives in the nation. He appeared at the Republican National Convention. He became a fixture on Fox News. He launched his own podcast, The Charlie Kirk Show. And when Donald Trump rose to power, Charlie Kirk rose with him. The alliance between Trump and Kirk was more than political. It was symbiotic. Trump needed youth. Kirk needed power. Together, they provided each other with both. Charlie Kirk would describe Trump as a warrior against elites, a man fighting for the forgotten. Trump, in turn, gave Kirk's organization access, credibility, and momentum. Turning Point USA's rallies became carnivals of conservative youth culture. Music, merch, and firebrand speeches. They were celebrations, but also battlefields. On one side, students waving American flags. On the other, protesters waving signs that screamed hate, fascism, lies. The energy was electric. The danger was real. And through it all, Charlie Kirk stood at the center, calm, smug to some, heroic to others. He was no longer just a campus agitator. He was a movement builder. But movements are messy, and controversy follows movements like shadows. Charlie Kirk's words, sharp, unfiltered, unyielding, began to spark accusations. He was accused of spreading misinformation about COVID-19. He amplified claims of election fraud in 2020, drawing condemnation from critics who said he was undermining democracy itself. He spoke against climate change policies, against elements of civil rights law, against what he called the indoctrination of America's children. For every supporter who saw him as a truth teller, there was an opponent who saw him as a liar. For every person who called him courageous, another called him dangerous. But isn't that the paradox of influence? You cannot polarize a nation unless you are powerful enough to matter. And Charlie Kirk mattered. Money poured in. By 2020, Turning Point USA's revenues had exploded into the tens of millions. Salaries grew. Properties were acquired. Questions swirled. Who was funding this empire? How was the money being used? Was this a grassroots youth movement or a slick machine with billionaire fuel? The scrutiny didn't stop the growth. Nothing seemed to. Kirk expanded into faith-based organizing, launching Turning Point Faith to mobilize churches. He declared culture wars as central to America's future, and he continued to sit before cameras and microphones, hosting The Charlie Kirk Show, where his clipped sentences and confrontational tone became his trademark. Millions watched, millions listened, millions argued, and whether they admitted it or not, millions were shaped. Yet, every rise carries within it the weight of a fall. And this is where Charlie Kirk's story takes its sharpest turn. By 2025, he was on the road with the American Comeback Tour, a traveling event designed to energize conservative youth and prepare for the next wave of elections. It was in Utah at Utah Valley University where the unthinkable happened. Shots rang out, panic swept the crowd, and Charlie Kirk, a man who had built his identity on being loud, unshakable, untouchable, was struck. The news spread like wildfire. Social media erupted. Supporters mourned. Critics paused. America gasped. For a decade, his voice had been a constant, and now it was gone. But what remains when a voice like that falls silent? This is the part that demands your attention, because the death of Charlie Kirk is not just the death of a man. It is the exposure of something much bigger. What does it mean that a teenager from the suburbs could alter the course of youth politics without ever earning a degree, without ever holding public office? What does it mean that one man's rhetoric could divide, mobilize, and radicalize all at once? And what does it mean that the battlefield he helped create is still here, pulsing, intensifying, waiting for the next voice to claim the microphone? You can dismiss Charlie Kirk. You can curse his name. You can celebrate his absence. But you cannot erase the fact that his story is our story, the story of a nation being pulled apart by conviction, fear, and power. And you, yes, you listening right now, have a choice. You can walk away from this video, scroll to the next distraction, and pretend you weren't shaken. Or you can subscribe, lock in, and stay with us as we continue to tell the stories that others are too afraid to confront. Because if you don't, you'll be back in the comments days from now, confessing regret, asking why you didn't choose to stay when you had the chance. And so I'll ask you, what do you fear more? Being provoked or being uninformed? Charlie Kirk's legacy will be debated for years. To some, he was a warrior who stood against the tide. To others, he was an agitator who inflamed division. To all, he was a force that could not be ignored. But the lingering question, the one you cannot escape, is this. In a world where a single voice can command millions, what happens when that voice falls silent? Have you ever asked yourself, what kind of voice can capture an entire generation? Not with a guitar, not with a Hollywood screen, but with words that could set a campus on fire, words that could push millions of young people to cheer, and millions of others to storm out in outrage? What if I told you that a single teenager, barely out of high school, became that voice, and that his rise was so fast, so sharp, that he was being called both the future of the Republican Party and the nightmare of American universities at the exact same time? And what if I told you that same voice, the 1 millions tuned into every day on their phones, on their laptops, in their cars, the one that dominated feeds with interviews that trended, arguments that ignited, and sound bites that couldn't be ignored, was silenced by a single shot in front of a live audience? That voice belonged to Charlie Kirk. And whether you admired him, hated him, laughed at him, or feared him, you cannot look away from what his story tells us about power, youth, and the terrifying price of influence. You need to hear this to the very end, because this is not just a biography. This is a warning. And if you don't subscribe right now, you're making a choice. You're choosing to walk past the mirror this story is holding up to you. You're choosing distraction over understanding. And when the next voice rises and the next crowd gathers, you'll be the one left saying in the comments, I should have listened. So do it now. Subscribe. Because what you're about to hear will follow you long after the screen goes dark. Charlie Kirk's rise was nothing short of astonishing. He was not born into Washington circles. He was not a polished intellectual trained by think tanks. He was a teenager from suburban Illinois who saw a gap, saw that conservatives his age had no rallying point, no champion, no stage. And he decided to build one. With Turning Point USA, Kirk turned the ordinary grind of campus activism into a theater of confrontation. He was only 18 when he launched it, yet within years, his name was stitched into the fabric of youth politics. He called out professors, challenged liberal orthodoxy, and set up his infamous professor watch list, which critics said was intimidation, but supporters hailed as bravery. The genius of Kirk was not just in showing up, it was in making people choose. Love him or hate him, you couldn't ignore him. Every rally was a clash, every interview a spark, every podcast an invitation to either cheer or recoil. And in that friction, his influence grew. He did not remain just a campus figure. He became a broadcaster, and through the Charlie Kirk Show, his words traveled further, faster, and louder than the walls of any lecture hall. His voice, sharp and urgent, poured daily into the earbuds of millions. He questioned vaccines, warned of cultural collapse, championed Trump, and declared himself a defender of American values. Some heard a patriot, others heard propaganda, but all heard him. And in the world of influence, hearing is everything. Charlie Kirk understood youth in ways the establishment often failed to. He spoke their language. He leaned into the viral culture of clips, debates, and trending interviews. His sit-downs with names like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and Ben Shapiro ricocheted across platforms, each segment designed to provoke sharing, arguing, reposting. He embraced confrontation not as a risk, but as a strategy. One of his most watched interviews was a heated exchange where he defended Trump's border policies against a young activist. The clip cut across political boundaries, trending not only on conservative pages, but on liberal ones as well, sparking outrage, parodies, and fierce defenses. This was the Kirk method, never speaking into a void, always engineering a storm. And storms draw crowds. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Kirk wasn't just a youth activist anymore. He was a cultural figure. The arenas he filled with Turning Point USA events were not the dusty halls of student meetings. They were stadiums with lights, music, and cameras rolling. He built stages where politics looked more like concerts, where ideology was merchandised, and where being conservative was packaged as rebellion. Think about that reversal. For decades, youth rebellion meant leaning left. Charlie Kirk flipped it. He made it rebellious to wave a flag, rebellious to wear a MAGA hat, rebellious to stand up in class and say, "I disagree." And that reversal cut deep into the culture of American campuses. Professors complained of intimidation. Students found themselves caught in ideological crossfire. Administrators wrestled with free speech controversies. But the bigger truth is this. Kirk forced America to see that its youngest generation was not marching in one direction. And that shook people. Of course, polarization is not without its costs. The sharper his words became, the more enemies he made. When COVID-19 spread, he questioned the vaccines. His statements ignited fury among medical professionals who accused him of misinformation. When Trump lost the 2020 election, Kirk amplified claims of fraud, earning accusations that he was undermining democracy itself. But to his followers, this was proof of courage. He was willing to say what others were too afraid to. He was willing to stand in the fire, absorb the backlash, and keep speaking. And that's why, love him or despise him, Charlie Kirk's shadow grew longer. The Charlie Kirk Show wasn't just a podcast. It became a daily pulse of the conservative youth movement. Clips trended on TikTok. Rants went viral on X. Interviews flooded Instagram Reels. He mastered the rhythm of online attention, short, sharp, and shareable. It wasn't just the words. It was the style. The way he leaned forward, never blinking. The way he delivered lines like punches. The way he pivoted from policy to faith, from economics to morality, weaving it all into a single tapestry of urgency. For many, he became a companion, a voice they listened to daily, like a friend guiding them through chaos. For others, he was a constant irritant, a reminder that the culture wars were not slowing down. But again, the point is not agreement. The point is reach. And Kirk's reach was vast. And then came the rallies, the American Comeback Tour, the massive Turning Point USA Student Action Summits, the gatherings where thousands of young conservatives chanted, cheered, and sang along with the rhythm of a movement. These were not quiet lectures. These were spectacles, choreographed for virality. designed to show the country that the right had youth on its side, too. The left laughed, dismissed, mocked. But mocking did not erase the images. Packed rooms of young people waving flags, posting selfies, and sharing their devotion to a man who had started as a teenager with a dream. And so the polarization deepened. Because if you thought Charlie Kirk was only noise, the images told you otherwise. But history never moves in a straight line. And Kirk's story was no exception. At Utah Valley University in 2025, the tour that had electrified campuses turned into tragedy. A gunshot, a crowd in chaos, a man whose voice had filled the air daily fell silent. The silence spread across news channels, across social media, across homes. For years, he had been a daily constant. Now the constancy was gone. Some wept, some celebrated, but everyone felt the shift. Because Charlie Kirk had been more than an individual. He had been a symbol of confrontation, a lightning rod, a mirror held up to America's fractures. And when the mirror shattered, the cracks it revealed were still there, sharper than ever. And so, we are left with questions that should disturb us. What does it mean when a teenager with no degree, no office, no title can outpace senators in influence? What does it mean when podcasts and trending clips command more loyalty than the nightly news? What does it mean when a man who spent a decade telling students to resist is himself cut down in an act of violence? Charlie Kirk forced these questions on us, and even in his absence, they remain unanswered. You can pretend you didn't hear this. You can scroll to the next video, numb yourself with distraction, and convince yourself it doesn't matter. But deep down, you know it does. Deep down, you know the story of Charlie Kirk is not just about him. It is about us, about the world we live in now. That's why I'm telling you again, subscribe. If you don't, you'll miss the threads that connect this tragedy to what comes next. And if you choose not to, then enter the comments. Write out your excuse. Tell everyone why you think ignorance is safer than awareness. Tell us why you won't take 5 seconds to stay alert to history as it unfolds. Because history will keep unfolding, with or without you. Charlie Kirk's influence among youth was undeniable. His shows trended, his interviews spread, his rallies filled arenas. He turned conservatism into rebellion, and rebellion into a brand. He was a polarizing figure, a constant voice, and now, a ghost echoing in the silence he left behind. And the silence should terrify you, because someone else is already filling it. And the question, the one that will haunt you long after this ends, is simple. Will the next voice be louder, sharper, more extreme? Or will it finally be one that heals? The answer depends on what we do next. Imagine a packed university hall. Bright lights, cameras rolling, students pressed shoulder to shoulder, some with notebooks, others with phones lifted high to capture every second. The stage is set for confrontation. The prove me wrong table stands like a magnet in the center of the room, inviting debate, daring anyone to challenge. Now imagine this. In a single moment, one sound, one crack in the air, the entire room transforms. Cheers turn into screams. Hands that held up signs and phones now cover faces. A man who had commanded the stage for over a decade collapses to the ground, blood pooling beneath his neck. And the voice that millions had tuned into every day is silenced. That was the day Charlie Kirk was shot. Utah Valley University, September 2025. And if you think this story doesn't matter to you, stop right here. Scroll away. But know this, when the threads of power and violence cross, it is never just about one man. It is about the world we all wake up in tomorrow. So subscribe now, because if you don't, you're telling yourself that ignorance is safer than truth. And when history repeats, and it always does, you'll be the one explaining in the comments why you walked away when you could have stayed. Charlie Kirk's tour was called the American Comeback Tour. It was designed as both a rallying cry and a stage for confrontation. At its heart was the prove me wrong table. The idea was simple yet explosive. Kirk or his team would set up a table, open the microphone, and invite anyone, student, professor, protester, to challenge his views in front of an audience. The format was a spectacle. On one side, a young conservative armed with facts, statistics, and confidence. On the other, students eager to push back, sometimes emotional, sometimes unprepared, sometimes surprisingly sharp. Clips from these events flooded the internet. They went viral, feeding Kirk's brand, fueling his critics, and drawing more crowds to the next stop. By the time the tour reached Utah Valley University, the formula was perfected. The anticipation was electric. Hundreds lined up, not just to watch, but to participate. For supporters, it was a chance to witness their champion dismantle what they called the lies of the left. For opponents, it was an opportunity to confront him on their home turf. The air was tense, but no one could have predicted what came next. It happened fast. Too fast for most in the crowd to even process. Charlie Kirk was mid-sentence, leaning toward the microphone, answering a challenge from a student. His voice carried over the crowd, sharp, deliberate, commanding attention as always. And then an eruption. A shot fired from within the hall. The bullet struck his neck. He stumbled. Gasps turned to screams. Students pushed against each other, some ducking for cover, others frozen in disbelief. The sound system caught the chaos. Shouts, cries, footsteps pounding against the floor. Security rushed the stage. Medics pressed forward, but the damage was done. The man whose voice had filled arenas, whose podcast reached millions, whose face had become a symbol of both defiance and division, now lay motionless. The silence after the shot was not a calm silence. It was the kind that makes the air feel heavy, the kind where every second feels stretched. And in that silence, an entire nation's polarization seemed to collapse into one horrifying reality. Words can inspire, words can inflame, and words can kill. The timeline of that day is etched in memory. Morning, Kirk arrived in Utah, energized, ready for another stop on a tour that had already drawn massive attention. He posted on social media, teasing the event, promising fireworks. His followers shared the post with excitement. His critics mocked it. The usual cycle. Afternoon, students gathered at Utah Valley University. The Prove Me Wrong table was set. Signs sprouted in the crowd, some supportive, some defiant. The media was present, ready to capture the exchange. Security checked bags and ID badges, though no one could check every corner of the swelling crowd. Evening, the event began. Charlie Kirk took the stage. His introduction was met with applause from one half of the room, boos from the other. He smiled. This was the arena he thrived in. The clash was the point. And then, moments into the debate, it happened. The gunshot, the chaos, the fall. In the hours that followed, the country convulsed. News alerts exploded across every screen. Charlie Kirk shot at Utah Valley University. Networks scrambled for footage. Social media melted under the weight of speculation, grief, rage, and, in some corners, celebration. The reactions revealed the fracture of America itself. Supporters wept openly, calling him a martyr for free speech. Critics, some carefully, some viciously, pointed to his words, his methods, and said this was the consequence of division. Politicians scrambled to respond, some condemning the violence, others already using it as ammunition for their own agendas. And through it all, one question lingered in the minds of millions: what now? Charlie Kirk was more than a man with a microphone. He was a symbol of how much influence a voice can carry in the digital age. His podcast, The Charlie Kirk Show, wasn't just a show, it was a movement in audio form, a place where daily politics was dissected and turned into battle lines. His interviews, from high-profile conservatives to fiery debates with young activists, dominated timelines. Clips trended, sparked outrage, inspired devotion. At Utah Valley University, that influence collided with violence. The man who thrived on confrontation met the most brutal confrontation of all. And the ripple effects are still spreading. So why does this matter? Why should you care? Because this wasn't just the story of Charlie Kirk. It was the story of what happens when youth politics, media virality, and cultural polarization reach a boiling point. It was the story of how a teenager from Illinois could create an empire, challenge the status quo, and end up bleeding on the floor of a university auditorium, all within a single decade. And if you think this is only about him, you're wrong. This is about the next voice, the next turn, the next table where ideas clash, the next shot that rings out. That is why you cannot look away. That is why you cannot tell yourself that this is distant, irrelevant, forgettable. And that is why you need to subscribe. Because if you don't, you will miss the threads tying this story to what comes next. And when the next voice rises, you'll be in the comments wishing you had stayed, wishing you had seen the warnings hidden in plain sight. The day of the incident will be studied, dissected, replayed endlessly. But no amount of analysis can change the raw truth of that moment. A man who had built a movement on speaking freely was silenced by a gunshot in front of the very audience he sought to engage. And here is the question you must wrestle with. What silences us faster, violence or indifference? Because violence takes a life, but indifference erases the lesson. And if we let this lesson fade, if we scroll past it, if we pretend it never mattered, then we guarantee that history will not just repeat, it will escalate. Charlie Kirk once said that the future of America would be decided by its youth. At Utah Valley University, that future was written in blood. But the ending has not been written yet. And the silence he left behind is not empty. It is waiting for the next voice to step forward. The question is, whose voice will it be? And will we listen? The sound of sirens, that is what people remember next. Not applause, not arguments, not chants from protesters or cheers from supporters. Just sirens, deafening, endless, as if the entire city of Orem, Utah, had turned its attention to one building. Charlie Kirk was still breathing when emergency responders pushed through the crowd. His face pale, his pulse fading, his shirt drenched in blood. Paramedics worked frantically, compressions, gauze, oxygen. Every second counted, and yet every second slipped away faster than the last. He was lifted onto a stretcher, rushed into the ambulance, and the doors slammed shut. From the outside, the flashing red light seemed almost hopeful. To the crowd left behind, supporters crying, opponents frozen in disbelief, it looked like there was still a chance. But to those inside the ambulance, the truth was much colder. His body was shutting down. The bullet had done its damage. Minutes later, at Utah Valley Regional Medical Center, the effort to save him reached its end. The announcement came swiftly, though the weight of it stretched on forever. Charlie Kirk was pronounced dead, age 31. And with that confirmation, shockwaves spread, not just through the hospital halls, not just across Utah, but across the entire nation. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what happens when the loudest voice in the room is suddenly gone? What happens when a man who commanded millions with every word is silenced, not by argument, but by a bullet? This is where I remind you, you cannot afford to watch this story halfway. Because this is not just about Charlie Kirk. This is about the fracture lines of an entire country. Subscribe right now, or you will end up in the comments pretending indifference is wisdom, when in reality, it is just cowardice. Don't be that person. News broke like an earthquake. Charlie Kirk dead after shooting at Utah Valley University. The headline ripped through every network. The speed of the announcement caught even seasoned reporters off guard. Push notifications flooded phones. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, every platform drowned in reactions. Supporters collapsed into grief. Across Turning Point USA's network, staff members wept openly, some streaming live as tears rolled down their faces. Chapters at universities nationwide held vigils that same night. Candles lit, flags lowered. The refrain was always the same: he gave us a voice. And they took him away. But critics responded differently. Some carefully acknowledged the horror of political violence, while also pointing to the years Kirk had spent stoking division, his confrontational debates, his uncompromising rhetoric. And in the darkest corners of the internet, there were celebrations, tweets and comments from those who despised him, who saw his death not as tragedy, but as justice. The speed and cruelty of those responses revealed just how deep the political fault lines had grown. Political leaders rushed to respond. Conservative figures declared him a martyr for free speech, a man killed for daring to challenge the dominant narrative. Donald Trump Jr. posted almost immediately, calling Kirk a hero who never backed down. Senators and governors echoed the sentiment, using the moment to galvanize their base. On the other side, Democratic leaders condemned the violence but walked a tightrope, acknowledging his death as horrific while distancing themselves from his ideology. President Joe Biden called it a dark day for America, pleading for calm. But the calls for calm were drowned by waves of outrage. The aftermath was not confined to politics. It hit families, students, ordinary people who had grown up watching Charlie Kirk spar on stages across America. For many young conservatives, Kirk wasn't just a figure on a screen. He was the first voice that made them feel like they weren't alone in classrooms that seemed stacked against them. His podcast had been their daily ritual. His words, the arguments they repeated in dorm rooms and family dinners. For them, his death wasn't news, it was personal. And for his critics, the ones who stood in those same classrooms feeling suffocated by his rhetoric, it was complicated. Grief mixed with anger. Some admitted they hated what he said, but never wanted this. Others whispered, sometimes too loudly, that this was the inevitable consequence of pushing division to its edge. The contrast in emotion was stark. And that starkness is what made the aftermath so dangerous. Because in the hours after the shooting, America was not united in grief. It was splintered even further apart. Think about this. One man dies, and instantly, millions interpret it not as a human tragedy, but as a political weapon. That is the environment we now live in. That is why this story matters far beyond Utah. And if you think you can walk away from this, if you think you can scroll on, ask yourself, what happens when the next tragedy is closer to home? Subscribe now. If you don't, come back and explain in the comments why you ignored the warning signs staring you in the face. At Utah Valley University, students were left traumatized. Some described the sound of the gunshot replaying in their heads on a loop. Others said they could still see his body collapse whenever they closed their eyes. Counselors were dispatched, but how do you counsel an entire generation that just witnessed their political reality explode into physical violence? Witnesses spoke to reporters through trembling voices. It didn't feel real, one student said. One moment he was debating, the next he was bleeding on the floor. It was like watching the internet come to life and then end right in front of us. The chaos on the ground transformed into a storm online. Videos from the event, some shaky and grainy, others disturbingly clear, spread faster than news networks could keep up. Millions watched Kirk's last words, the sudden crack, the screams. Millions replayed it, some in mourning, some in rage, some, disturbingly, in satisfaction. The hospital confirmation sealed what some had still been clinging to as hope. Once his death was official, the reactions shifted into full-scale battle. Hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag justice for Kirk. Hashtag end political violence. Hashtag free speech martyr. Opposing hashtags rose in tandem, mocking him, dissecting his career, questioning whether his words bore responsibility for the moment that ended his life. Television networks filled entire nights with wall-to-wall coverage. Documentaries rushed into production. Commentators dissected every angle. Was security to blame? Was the university negligent? Was the shooter driven by ideology or personal grievance? And behind those questions, an unspoken fear grew louder. Was this only the beginning? The emotional weight of that day cannot be overstated. Supporters described it as the moment the floor was ripped out from under them. Critics felt conflicted, their opposition to him now tangled with the raw reality of his mortality. Political leaders scrambled to control the narrative. But ordinary Americans, students, parents, workers scrolling their phones, felt something deeper. A realization that the world had changed in one evening. Because this wasn't just about Charlie Kirk anymore. It was about the terrifying reminder that words and bullets had become inseparable in America's story. And here's the question I'll leave you with tonight. If the death of one man can shake the nation like this, what will it take for the nation to finally look in the mirror? Let me ask you a question that no headline, no press conference, and no statement from officials has fully answered. Who pulled the trigger that ended Charlie Kirk's life? And why? It is easy to repeat the phrase, a gunman opened fire. It is easy to report that security rushed, paramedics fought, and doctors failed to bring him back. But behind that single bullet lies an ocean of unanswered questions. Questions that stretch far beyond the walls of Utah Valley University. Questions that may never be fully answered, but cannot be ignored. And before we step further into this dark corridor, I'll tell you right now, if you think you can watch this casually with half your attention, you're wrong. Because these questions aren't just about Charlie Kirk. They're about you, your country, your future. If you don't subscribe now, then when the truth knocks at your door, you'll be the one scrambling in the comments, trying to explain why you chose ignorance when you had a chance to be prepared. Don't scroll. Don't click away. Stay. The shooter. Who was he or she? Was this a face in the crowd who had been planning for weeks? A student at the university? A protester? A stranger with no connection at all? Witnesses described fragments, someone moving too quickly, someone holding something concealed, someone disappearing in the rush. But clarity is rare in chaos. In the hours after, names floated through social media. Accusations flew. But official confirmation was slow, painfully slow. And here lies the first unsettling question. Why? Why did it take so long to identify the attacker? Was it because law enforcement struggled to piece it together? Or was it because someone, somewhere, wanted time to control the story before the truth escaped? Then comes motive. Was Charlie Kirk targeted for who he was? Was this a direct strike against his ideology, his platform, his voice? Or was he merely in the wrong place at the wrong time? Caught in the path of someone consumed by rage that had nothing to do with politics? Supporters are convinced it was targeted. To them, there is no doubt Kirk's words, his dominance in the conservative youth movement, his ability to fill arenas and control the narrative made him a threat. They believe someone wanted to silence him deliberately. But others argue differently. They whisper that maybe this was not about politics at all. Maybe it was a personal vendetta. Maybe the shooter had grievances hidden from public view. Maybe the debate stage was only a backdrop for something much more intimate. The question remains suspended, unresolved. Was Charlie Kirk killed because of what he represented, or because of something else entirely? And then there is the matter of security. How does a man as high profile as Charlie Kirk, a man who traveled with teams, who drew thousands to every stop, who faced constant protest and pushback, end up shot in the middle of a university auditorium? Where were the checkpoints? Where was the scanning equipment? Where were the protective barriers between the stage and the audience? Those who were in the crowd swear they saw bags being checked, IDs verified. But clearly something slipped through. Was it incompetence? Was it oversight? Or was it negligence at the highest level? Some even whisper about something darker, that maybe this wasn't a failure at all, but a breach, a hole in the wall that wasn't accidental. And I ask you, what if that's true? What if the very people who were supposed to protect him looked the other way? There were warning signs too. Or were there? That's the question investigators are still unraveling. Some students claim they saw messages online days before, cryptic posts about the tour stop in Utah, hints of violence, vague threats dismissed as trolling. Did security see them? Did law enforcement? And if they did, why wasn't action taken? Others say they saw a man pacing outside the venue long before the event began, his behavior strange, his eyes distant. But no one intervened, because no one thought this would really happen. And yet it did. So I ask again, were the warning signs invisible, or were they ignored? Each question leads to another, and the weight of them all grows heavier. Who was the shooter? Why did they do it? Was it political? Was it personal? Was it preventable? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, if it happened here, in this place, to this figure, what's to stop it from happening again? These are the questions no press release can answer. These are the questions no politician wants to stand behind a podium and confront. Because the answers, if they exist, will tear through the fabric of how we view security, free speech, and even democracy itself. And here's where I tell you something uncomfortable. These questions don't end with Charlie Kirk. They are waiting for the next voice, the next event, the next crowded auditorium. And if you walk away from this video without subscribing, without staying engaged, then you are choosing blindness. And blindness, in times like these, is dangerous. If you don't want to face the truth, fine. Leave a comment and explain why. Explain why you would rather scroll past history than confront it head-on. But for the rest of you, the ones who know that these questions demand answers, stay. Because tonight, we don't close this story with certainty. We close it with silence. The silence of unanswered questions. The silence of a nation wondering if this was an act of ideology or madness or both. The silence of families asking if someone should have seen it coming. And maybe the hardest silence of all, the silence left behind by a voice that millions tuned into every day, now replaced by nothing but echoes. So I'll leave you with this. Was Charlie Kirk's death the result of one person's hatred, or the symptom of something far larger consuming America? The answer has not been given. The investigation is still open. But the debate, that starts with you. What if I told you that the official version of Charlie Kirk's death is not the only version? What if I told you that while law enforcement insists the investigation is straightforward, millions online are building entirely different stories? Stories that question whether we've been told the whole truth. This is where the tragedy shifts from grief to something more unsettling. Because when the facts are scarce, the vacuum is filled with speculation. And in that speculation lies the power to divide, to persuade, to inflame. If you think you can afford to hear this with half your attention, let me warn you, these competing narratives will shape how history remembers Charlie Kirk. If you do not subscribe right now, then when the truth surfaces, you will be in the comments scrambling to explain why you ignored the evidence staring you in the face. Don't be the fool who waits until it's too late. Stay with me. The official story is careful. Law enforcement has been measured in every statement. According to their reports, a lone suspect fired a single shot from within the auditorium. The suspect was apprehended. No motive confirmed. No details released. The language is clinical, stripped of drama, designed to reassure the public that everything is under control. But is it? Because outside the press conferences, a very different story is taking shape. Online forums swarm with speculation. Was this a lone wolf, or part of something coordinated? Why did it happen in Utah, a state where Kirk had strong support? Was the shooter politically motivated, or was there a deeper personal grievance that authorities aren't disclosing? Some even whisper of a security conspiracy. They ask, how did a man so heavily protected at such a publicized event end up with a bullet in his neck? Was this incompetence, or something darker? The evidence itself is messy. The timeline is clear enough. The event began in the evening. Kirk engaged with students. A shot rang out. Chaos erupted. But when you peel back the surface, contradictions appear. Witnesses insist they saw more than one person behaving suspiciously in the hours before. Some describe seeing someone with a concealed weapon. Others say they heard two distinct noises, not one. The official report says one gun, one shooter, one bullet. But the crowd's memory does not perfectly align. Footage tells its own story. Videos captured on shaky phones show Kirk collapsing, security scrambling, students screaming. Yet the angle rarely captures the shooter directly. Some frames seem to show movement in different sections of the hall, as if more than one figure was in play. Law enforcement dismisses this as confusion in chaos. But should we dismiss it so quickly? And then there are the missing details. The identity of the suspect remains sealed. Motive unconfirmed. Connections undisclosed. Why the silence? Why the withholding? Authorities say they want to protect the investigation. But critics argue that secrecy breeds only more suspicion. This is where you, the viewer, step into the role of detective. Do you believe the official account, the clean and contained version presented at podiums? Or do you believe the crowd, the students, the shaky cameras capturing what may be fragments of a larger puzzle? Because in this case, certainty is a luxury we do not have. Zoom out for a moment. Consider the bigger picture. The year is 2025. America is more polarized than ever. College campuses have become battlegrounds, not for weapons, but for ideology. Protests flare at political events with increasing regularity. Threats are common, almost expected. Security officials have warned for years that an attack like this was inevitable. So when Charlie Kirk was killed, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symptom of a country where words are not just debated, they are weaponized. A country where free speech rallies require bulletproof vests. A country where politics and safety are no longer separate. The bigger picture is chilling. If Kirk, with his security, his prominence, his experience navigating hostile crowds, could be struck down, then who is safe? And what does that mean for the future of open dialogue in America? Let me put the question directly to you. Was this a politically motivated assassination? A targeted strike against a voice too powerful to ignore? Or was it a preventable tragedy, born of negligence, mismanagement, and missed warning signs? Was it the act of one person, or the result of something larger at play? Something coordinated, something hidden? Who do you think is responsible, and why? The truth is still unfolding. The case is not closed, and yet the battle for the narrative has already begun. History is being written in real time, and you are watching it happen. So here's your call to action. Don't walk away. Don't tell yourself someone else will figure it out. Your opinion matters. What do you believe really happened to Charlie Kirk? Drop your theory in the comments below, and subscribe now because this story isn't over. We will keep investigating. And when the next piece of evidence emerges, you don't want to be the one hearing about it secondhand. The bullet ended Charlie Kirk's life, but the questions it left behind are only just beginning.